Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Keisha Rogers, and we have a very exciting discussion and guest speaker with us today, Marsha Freeman, who I will introduce in just a moment. But what I want to do first is sort of situate the importance of this discussion from the standpoint of what's needed to bring the world out of the brink of war and despair and to bring the world into the new paradigm which is awaiting mankind. And I think we really have to look at what has happened to a sense of mission and optimism that we once had in this nation, that there were no obstacles that we could not handle. There were no challenges that were too big for us. There was no destination that we didn't feel we could not conquer. And I think it's important, as I introduce our speaker for today, Marsha, I wanted to start off by reminding people about the idea of moving mankind forward that we had with a sense of optimism for this nation under President John F. Kennedy. And today we're going to be talking about the direction not only of our U.S. space program, but how nations like China are breaking new ground in the exploration of space for all of mankind, and breaking new ground in research that has never been done by any nation on the planet. And let me just start, because many people we go back to the idea of President John F. Kennedy and his speech, which some people in the room probably were in high school or middle school or not even born, like myself. But this speech, preschool, yeah, preschool, okay. And this speech at Rice University by John F. Kennedy still has an effect on people even to this day, and it shapes the generation. It has had a profound effect on generations even afterwards. So this is September 12th, 1962. John F. Kennedy. Now, I just want to read a section from this speech that I think really situates how we have to think about the direction of the world today, which is, he says, "We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man, and only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence, can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying threat of war. I do not say that we should or will go unprotected against the hostile misuse of space any more than we go unprotected against the hostile use of land or sea. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending its right around this globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again." These are the words of President John F. Kennedy before he gives the famous line of why we choose to go to the moon. In this decay, and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And as President Kennedy said in that speech, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. So as we look at the challenges that we're facing in the world right now, the threat of war, the degeneracy in culture, and many people are seeing, on the one hand, we have a outbreak of terrorism and warfare that's going on in Southwest Asia. And Mrs. LaRouche has made clear that it's going to be this mindset of thinking that we have to look to organize the best energies and talents of every single citizen, peace through economic development. She gave a beautiful speech this past week on how to overcome the conflict confronting mankind right now. This conflict will only be overcome when we decide that we're going to move away from geopolitics, away from accepting a society that puts financial oligarchy and an empire that seeks to colonize and pit nations and people against each other. Now, what we have offered in this organization, through the LaRouche movement and through my campaign for United States Congress, District 9 here, is to put forth a leading platform for this nation in what has now been defined as the campaign to win the future, the 2018 election platform. And if people have not read this, I would encourage you not only to read it, but to support, to sponsor several copies. For you, if you can't see the title, it's called LaRouche PAC 2018 Campaign to Win the Future, LaRouche's 4 Laws for Economic Recovery, a New Paradigm for Mankind. And this platform very much focuses on the essential recovery program that has been laid out by economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche on his four laws to restore our republic. And starting with Glass-Steagall banking reorganization, that's the first law, separation of commercial from investment banking and other speculative activities, creating a new Hamiltonian national bank to issue credit for economic development, directing credit to projects which increase the productivity and physical well-being of the population, such as large-scale infrastructure projects, and creating a crash program for the development of fusion power and expanding exploration. And these 4 laws go right in hand with my platform and campaign slogan, Great Projects for a Great America. So as leading candidate promoting and endorsing this campaign platform, I want to say again that I call and challenge all candidates running for political office to take up the policies that have been initiated in this platform and demand that this has to become the subject of discussion for our national campaigns. So now let me just state a few things as to why it is this organizing in the way that Kennedy thought of a sense of mission and optimism that has to be restored to the nation again, not only our nation, but our relationship to other nations. Right now, that the idea that we would see, as some congressmen are doing, looking at other nations as a mortal enemy or threat, such as China and Russia, are not in the interest of mankind, not in the interest of our nation and the progress of ending the conflict, which is continuing to rear its ugly head in society. But it's only going to be through understanding that the breakthroughs and discoveries that are made in the advancements of science and technological progress are going to be breakthroughs for all of mankind. And Marsha Freeman, who is going to be our speaker today, has just written a beautiful article on those breakthroughs that are now being established in China in their commitment to the exploration of space. And her article focuses on what they're doing with the developments of putting instruments on the lunar far side, and she will be able to tell you more about that. But I just wanted to say in that context, I was reading today that there is a new report that was just put out. Give me a moment here. Make sure I have the. Okay, here we go. New report that was just put out, a study done on May 17th by the United Way Alice, called the Alice Project. And it really is painting the devastating picture of the poverty that's afflicting millions of US families. And I think the problem is when we've actually had a culture that's accepted the idea that poverty is something that's just always going to be there. People say war is always going to be there. People say poverty is always going to be there. These are this is the mindset that's actually feeding into and going along with this bestial view of mankind. And this is what we have to actually rid ourselves of. And so the article, the study, talks about how there's millions of US families, many of whose members are employed but don't earn enough to cover the minimum amount needed to sustain a family. It goes through statistics that 51 million US households don't earn enough to afford a monthly budget to cover the housing, food, childcare, healthcare, transportation, and even cell phone costs. 43% of all US households includes 16 million families living in poverty, plus 34.7 million families who fall below the category of Alice, even below that line that I was just describing. And that they have a limited income. That is, they make less than what's necessary to, quote, survive in a modern economy. And then it goes through a number of states that fall deep into that category, including which face massive financial hardship. States like California, New Mexico, Hawaii have the largest percentage of struggling families, which, it's kind of interesting right now because Hawaii is in a devastating situation. You have the erupting of a volcano there that is causing for even many of the citizens there to have to be threatened to be evacuated. But we have to look at the progress of mankind, the progress of a recovery program based on the idea that the advancements in science and technology, as has been described in LaRouche's 4 laws right now, are critical for saving mankind from the brink of despair. Now, you also have to look at this as absolutely critical to addressing the culture of death and violence that is taking over our society. And I know this is on people's minds. We cannot get to the point where we say Parkland, we had Santa Fe, we have this, and people become desensitized. Right, that's going on right now to solve. There is no addressing of reality from the standpoint that we mission. We have lost our sense of optimism in society. These young people don't have a future. And the same response that Mrs. LaRouche gave to the idea of overcoming the conflicts of war by building the territories in these war-ridden areas, by actually going for peace through development. This is the way that you're going to bring peace to the mindsets of these young people whose future has been taken away. How? Because we've said our space program now is irrelevant. That the space program should be something for some rich guys with multi-billions of dollars to be able to take over. Instead of saying that the space program is the instrument by which we catalyze our greatest forces of scientific creative progress in our nation. And so when I look at things such as the fact that we are bickering over how much money we have for the International Space Station, and that or cutting programs to can't afford that. But we'll see if the commercial sector can pick it up. They trust the space flight. Are they even prepared to take true science hits and so forth? Know that that's not the case. Marsha will talk more about this. That now we're talking about, well, it's probably not going to be the case that we can send our astronauts, our American astronauts, to the International Space Station. So we better start training the cosmonauts to run the American arm of the International Space Station. So this is where we have gone, where we have put complete insanity for our commitment to the and of our nation, society. Countries such as we can't let them because they're a threat and they're going to security. Well, we've been our own threat to our own national security. So on the brink of a paradigm shift like nothing we've ever seen before, if we do our jobs, if we actually commit the nation to embark upon the types of breakthrough for mankind that has been established by economist Lyndon LaRouche, and which right now many nations around the world, including Russia and China, have defined as their new commitment for ending poverty and for the progress of mankind. So I think that's where I want to leave my remarks today, because there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of details. But I think key thing right now is, if we want to see this happen in the United States, we have to the enemy within that is preventing this progress from moving forward. That you are now at a point right now who want to see the under opponent there, Mr. Al Green, and his FBI and Wall Street controllers, but also those who right now what you see is that why is this the case? It's the case because when you had for the first time a commitment toward this conception of a new mission for the country, which was stated in a program to return to the moon, a lunar program. Now this is being backed away from, and we have to make sure that nothing gets in the way of that commitment, that stated commitment and intention, that we now have to organize ourselves in this country, that we're going to have a restored national mission in the exploration of space as a driver for progress, for advancing our economy again, for ending poverty once and for all. And so I think with that, I want Marsha's been a great, written many, Marsha, on anything on space, I need to go to Marsha. She in the field of space, but has authored. She's also authored hundreds of articles. She's also written on the shuttle program, the Mir space station program, written books on the great space pioneer Kraft Erika, written books on how we got to the moon, and the German space pioneers, and it would probably take me about 20 minutes to go through all of Marsha's biography here. But I think what she just wrote recently, we have to think about it in the context, not just of, and I'm sure she will present this, of looking at that nation over there, China's doing this, and what are we doing over here versus what is another nation doing. But the breakthroughs that are on the brink of being made and discovered is going to transform the whole of mankind. And the United States is part of that beautiful new direction that that mankind's ready to embark on. We're not going to achieve positive society. So, and say hello, Marsha. I'll introduce you now.
Thank you, Keisha. It's a pleasure being with all of you.
Hello downstairs.
Am I good?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, if everything falls into place, tomorrow should be a very exciting day. About 5 o'clock in the evening, Eastern Standard Time, in other words, where I am here on the East Coast, a small spacecraft will be launched from China. It'll be Monday morning, their time, and it'll head for the moon. This is a little satellite, less than 1,000 pounds, and it is going to be performing a unique new function, something that's never been done before. It's not going to be orbiting the moon. It's going to be sent past the moon. It's going to get to the moon, keep on going, and act as a relay satellite, because by the end of the year, November or December, a follow-on spacecraft, Chang'e 4, is going to be launched, also from China, and it's going to land on the far side of the moon. Now, you're all aware there is no dark side, but there is a face of the moon that never faces the Earth. It's about 40% of the surface of the moon, and we refer to it as the far side, the non-Earth facing side of the moon. This has never been done before by any country. It's not easy, so that's probably the explanation of why. From the far side of the moon, it's not possible to communicate directly with the Earth because you're facing away. So this little satellite that's going up tomorrow is going to be a relay. It will be able to talk to both the Earth and the spacecraft on the lunar far side at the same time. It's going to be in what's called a halo orbit, where it sort of makes just a very tight circle. It doesn't really go anywhere. It sort of hovers in place. And again, we'll be able to relay messages from mission control, from the engineers on the Earth, and commands up to the spacecraft, and then take the data, all the scientific findings that the lander and the rover find on the lunar surface, and relay that back to Earth. So this is going to be a very exciting mission, kind of high risk, but the Chinese pursue these missions when they feel they're ready. Regardless of what you read about an Asian space race, and you can read an article once a week about people talking about China in competition with Japan, South Korea, mostly India. The Chinese view of it is that they are in this for the long haul. They have a multi-decade, multi-generational view of exploring space, exploiting space. In other words, not just to see it as something out there, but to do what Craft Erica mentioned, which Keisha has talked a lot about, which is actually bringing the economy that you can set up on the moon integrated with the economy on the Earth. So they have a very long-term view of exploring, sending people, setting up industry, looking for resources. And of course, one of the most important, or one of interest, is going to be searching out for helium-3. Now, helium-3 is very rare on the Earth, but the sun has been depositing it on the surface of the moon for billions of years. And of course, there's no weather up there. There's no atmosphere to speak of. So it's just been collecting, more or less on the surface and not too deep underneath. Now, there are no veins, there are no big mines on the moon of helium-3, but we can mine it, we can separate it, we can ship it back to Earth, and we can use it as fuel in fusion reactors. Also, of course, we'll use it on the moon for our fusion reactors there. So the Chinese don't expect to do that in a week or a month or a year. But again, looking at it for the long haul, fusion is the future. Fusion fuel for using helium-3 is superior to anything else. So you lay out a multi-decade program, make a commitment, fund it, educate the people, bring in the talent, and do it. So this is a well thought out incremental program, taking on challenges with each mission. They never repeat what they've done before. If it's been successful, you move on to the next step. The Chang'e 4 Lunar Farside mission has a number of other firsts, actually. In addition to being the first spacecraft to ever land on the far side, it's going to be the first spacecraft to bring a little miniature biosphere to the moon. The lifeless moon is going to have some life on it. There's a capsule, and inside a little tin, very small, there are seeds. It's a mustard kind of plant, and the seeds are in there. Also, silkworms that are ready to come out. The idea here is that the seeds will photosynthesize, produce oxygen in that process, and the oxygen will be used by the silkworms. Kind of a neat little closed biosphere. Well, they don't know if it'll work or not, but it's an experiment that they're going to try. It was developed by university students, and it would be the first little closed biosphere on the moon. So this is the lunar program that China has outlined. And again, it's from the standpoint of a long-term effort, not competing with anyone, not in a race, doing it for the reasons that President Xi Jinping has outlined, to move China from a position of third world status to become a major contributor to science and technology, and to become what he called a knowledge-based society, right? Where the driver for economic growth is investments in science and technology. You know, people have complained for years that everything that China has done in space, the United States has done before. Not only that, we did it in the 1960s. Well, starting with this Chang'e 4 mission on the lunar far side, China is, as I was mentioning in the article and Keisha mentioned, it's going to break new ground. From now on, China is going to be doing some certain things that no other country has done before. That's called leadership, right? Leadership is breaking new ground, pushing forward the frontier, and working in the scientific areas that have not been tackled before. Now, in addition to the lunar program, China has, of course, a manned space program. And I just want to say something about the funding which was raised. It's incredible to me how people make the argument, and you hear this every day, day in and day out, Democrats, Republicans, everyone on Capitol Hill, we can afford to put more money into the space program. As Keisha mentioned, this privatization craze has taken hold of Washington. We don't have money in the NASA budget to do these things, so maybe private industry will do it. Let's see if industry has any ideas on how to land on the moon. This is literally what they're doing now. We used to have scientists and engineers at NASA who developed ideas and then went to industry to work on them together. But now we're saying NASA has no money to do this, so we'll let commercial companies do it. Well, this is a fool's errand. It's not a national mission. And this is really going to lead nowhere, frankly. It's not going to result in what you want at any rate. But to make the argument that there isn't the money to do this is really a question of turning reality on its head. When people used to say, even during the 60s, even when we were fulfilling John F. Kennedy's program to put a man on the moon, it's too expensive, it costs too much. People used to say in response to that, you know, none of the money that we're spending in the space program are we spending on the moon. It is being spent in colleges, universities, industries, small innovative companies, educating more scientists and engineers. That's what the money is going for. And, you know, we've published and people have referred often to the estimates that have been made that for every dollar invested in the space program, in new science and technology and manpower, that there's a $7–10 return on investment. What can you invest in that gets that kind of return that's legal, right? I mean, you can invest in a new gambling casino, but in terms of a return to the economy, in new technology, in higher productivity, in more scientists and engineers. There is nothing that you can invest in with a higher return than the space program. So I would like to leave it at that, just as sort of an introduction on a few points, and see if people have questions and what they would like to discuss.
How do we do this, Mike?
I'm going up here.
Yeah. Jackie.
Okay. We have a question here. She can hear you, so go ahead. You can just talk.
Just talk loud.
If helium, I don't know much about, atoms and everything, but how, if you wanted to make helium-3 on the Earth, do we have the technology to smash atoms together or whatever and get the number of protons or whatever it is that needs to be in the nucleus to make the helium-3 on Earth? So I'm just curious. I mean,
Did you hear that, Marsha?
Yes, I did. It's an interesting question. There is some helium-3 on Earth, but very little of it, so it's used very sparingly, and not really so much yet for fusion experiments. I don't know the answer to that question, and technically, it probably would not be very easy to do it. So I really don't know. It sounds like it would be possible. I don't know how easy it would be, though.
You have a question?
Okay. Earlier, speaking of leadership, with Mike Pence as the head of the seems to want to use the space program. Armageddon. Is Scott Pace part of the Christian Zionist faction, or is he more of a technical expert in?
The audio broke up terribly.
Okay. Can you hear me?
So far, but you were breaking up pretty badly too. Try.
Okay. He was saying that Pence is a part of the Christian Zionist networks, and saying is
part of this question more of a technical,
or see more of a technical expert for NASA?
Oh no, Mike Pence certainly is not a technical expert. It's very interesting, this question of leadership.
Scott Pace.
Oh, Scott Pace.
Yes.
Oh, we see the audio is not clear. Scott Pace is not a technical guy per se. He worked for NASA, but in a policy position. I don't remember his exact title, but I don't think his background is in engineering at all. But again, he was a policy and plans, or policy and evaluation was his title. Then he became a professor at George Washington University. So engineering and technical questions is not his area of expertise. Scott Pace is going to do whatever Pence brings to the Space Council from the White House. Scott Pace himself is a decent guy, but the really space policy is set by the White House. People sometimes make the mistake and blame NASA for everything. NASA just does what they're told. The policy comes from the White House. And unfortunately, what you've got, this question of leadership came up in the, 9-10 months that we didn't have a NASA administrator, because this fellow Bridenstine had been nominated by President Trump. Nobody liked him. It was sort of a bipartisan opposition. But the grounds on which they were opposing his nomination were ridiculous. Basically saying he wasn't qualified. Now, they were making the qualification that he wasn't a scientist and engineer, and that's what you should have to run the agency. The man who ran the Apollo program for 8 years, without whom there would not have been a landing on the moon, was Jim Webb. Jim Webb was a political appointee. President Kennedy knew exactly what he was doing, putting Webb in the position of heading NASA for the purpose of the lunar landing. And Webb was a political appointee who was totally committed to the NASA mission, to President Kennedy. He was a Roosevelt Democrat. In other words, politically, his mind was in the right place. As a matter of fact, and Keisha and I and others have discussed this at length, Webb and other people at NASA, we're talking about now the early 60s, saw the space program as a way to intervene in the economic, social situation in the United States. Think about the early 1960s. This is before the civil rights legislation, before the anti-poverty programs. Just still a horrible, horrible situation in many parts of the country. And Webb, who had a social agenda and a political savvy, thought we could use the space program, the science, the technology to intervene in the situation in the South, which, never progressed much after the Civil War. If you look at a map of the United States and you look at where the NASA centers are, they're not in Boston or Chicago, right? They are in Florida, Virginia, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, right? All of the southern states. And this was done consciously to say, let's bring centers of science and technology to the South and see if we could start to, make some inroad into the social, economic situation in these states. So you don't have to be a scientist or engineer to be a administrator of NASA and know what you're doing and carry forward these important programs. The problem with Bridenstine is that he would sell the whole space agency to the highest bidder. It's a policy question. It's not a personality or an educational one. His policies are bad, are wrong. And that's the problem we've got right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, Marsha. Marsha.
Hi.
Hello, Jennings. Remember me? I got to speak to an astronaut last week, a lady who was American but has roots in India, and she gave us a picture of the world from the space station, right? Because this was actually a cultural event. It wasn't not a NASA event. And I asked her about the Chinese program, and she said, "Look, we at NASA, we astronauts, right? Even though we don't have any official relation with China, we were really hoping, we were holding our breath when the first taikonaut mission went up there. We really wanted it to succeed, right? And then I brought up this question of Mars, and she said, Mars, the mission is so big, I don't think we can go as Americans. We have to go as humans. We have to have an effort involving all the nations of the world to make this thing happen." And I had made the comparison with the New Silk Road and the potential that represents. So before the Chang'e mission makes it to the landing on the far side of the moon, what might we be see coming back from this stationary orbit thing that's going up on Monday? Photo images and things like that. Will that be coming back our way?
I don't know. There are two other little spacecraft that are hitching a ride with the relay satellite. And these are small microsatellites. It's very neat. They're gonna fly. They're gonna leave the relay satellite, and they're gonna orbit the moon, actually at very eccentric orbits. And they're gonna fly in formation, which changes. The distance between them will change. And they are carrying basically it's a radio astronomy experiment, and they will be, operating for months before Chang'e 4 gets to the moon. So that's going to be ongoing. The relay satellite has a couple of instruments on it, but really its primary function is really this communications. It's got the antennas and all the equipment to do the relay. It's very interesting because they expect the relay satellite to last, I hope it will operate for 5 years. And the Chinese have made an offer that if another country wants to send a mission, it would be to the far side, they could use China's relay satellite. So that's kind of neat. Well, the other thing that really was a groundbreaking aspect of this mission is how open it is, how many other countries are involved in having instruments on board. China has done a remarkable job in going from a program that was really, really closed, really sort of following in the footsteps of the early Soviet Union. The launches were not live. You never knew if the mission was a success or not. To now, of course, televising everything live and inviting other countries to come along. So it's really a very dramatic change.
I have another question.
Go for it.
I have some idea of what the advantages are to putting a lander on the far side of the moon to see out into the universe, not interfered by the noise coming from the sun. But maybe you could elaborate what the opportunity is in terms of detection of things from that far side of the moon that we've never have been able to do before.
Well, I think there are two parts of that. One is what you mentioned, which is, the radio interference from the Earth-facing side of the moon really prevents much radio astronomy from being done either from the surface of the Earth or even in orbit around the Earth, because you have that interference. We make a lot of radio noise down here. So when you're on the far side and you don't have that radio interference, any of the low frequency part of the spectrum that you haven't been able to look at from Earth, you'll be able to see from the moon. So you'll be able to see two things. You'll be able to see things that we've never seen before, perhaps galaxies or other kinds of celestial bodies. And you'll also see things that we have seen before, like planets or asteroids or comets, but you're going to see them in a manner of speaking in a new light, right? It's like the work that NASA's done looking at, let's say, the sun. They've done a remarkable job. You can find this on the internet, of how the sun looks in a whole range of different wavelengths. And it looks very different in the X-ray or the gamma ray, or, you know, the visual, the optical. So you actually can look at objects that we know what they look like, so to speak, like the planets, but looking them at in a different frequency, you're going to see different things. And then you'll be able to detect things that we've never seen before.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, and it's not space related, but it's energy related. I don't know. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, she can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was just kind of wondering. I read a book and it was talking about a system that was built in Switzerland. It's supposed to be like an atom smasher that they built over there. It's supposed to be underground, and this then goes, in a circle for high speed, and smashes the atom into providing what they call the antimatter.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, is that a technology that is being pursued, or is that just an illusion?
He's talking about, can you hear, Marsha?
Yes, no, I heard.
Okay, good.
Does he know, Keisha, that they were building one in Texas?
No, no, a superconductor. No.
An underground ring. I can't remember what it was called. This was a number of years ago.
Super collider.
Yeah, the superconducting super collider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they never finished that project.
Oh, was it Texas UT?
Waco.
Oh, Waco. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Europeans have CERN, which is a high energy physics operation. Yeah, no, it's real. I don't remember what state of things it's in, but yeah, they have gone ahead. We're one of the few countries that starts projects and doesn't finish them. We have to change that.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not an accident, it's sabotage.
Yeah.
Not a mistake.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Marsha, last week Joel DeJean gave a presentation about this small fusion engine that Lockheed Martin is working on. Do you know of any discussion of, what can you say about the potential of that for space flight?
We've been in discussion back and forth about it. I have no sense of it more than what has been out in the public domain. There's always that's the problem with these private companies doing some of the research, is that really they consider it proprietary, and in a certain sense they have to. And they're going to get patents for things and try to get protection for the technology. And it to me, there was just a lack of detail, so I couldn't figure out too much of it. He probably did a better job than I did.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, come on. Mm-hmm.
Marsha, I wanted to ask, the Chinese are very interested in the helium-3 as a resource, but I don't hear much about their work on fusion. So do you have any information on how they're progressing or what kind of state their research is in?
Well, yes, we know quite a bit about their fusion program. Not everything. A lot of these areas are dual-use areas in terms of military, civilian, and actually they are making a very specific effort to open up some of the military research for civilian applications. Again, this is something that the U.S. has been very, very good at doing in terms of technology spin-offs from NASA or even from the fusion research in the U.S. And the Chinese are just really edging their way into that. The Chinese have one of the 2 superconducting tokamaks in the world. We've printed interviews with the head of the Chinese fusion program. They have a more aggressive timetable in terms of actually ever getting to fusion. than any of the other countries working on it. Again, they don't see it as an academic project or just an interesting scientific experiment. It's like the lunar industrialization or the question of mining helium-3. It's a matter of how do you get to the next platform? And that's the way they look at it, and that's why they can have a 20 or 30-year perspective. Their program for fusion is, of course, they're one of the partners in ITER, the International Tokamak Experimental Reactor that's being built in France. But they have a very aggressive, their own domestic program. Again, they have their superconducting tokamak, and they have already started to do design work for the next step. Now, in the 1970s, when the US fusion program was really moving along, getting funding, making breakthroughs, we didn't wait till a machine was finished to start the next one. We actually did them in an overlapping manner so that when one machine was producing results, the next one was already under construction. Well, we don't do that anymore, and really almost no country does. That's what the Chinese are doing. They are not going to wait 10 years till ITER is completed and producing results. They, in parallel, are planning their next step machine. It'll be an engineering test reactor. And before ITER is producing science, they will be building it. So they see by the 2030s to have a commercial demonstration reactor based on a tokamak design. They have other machines and configurations under development as well. But, the tokamak is the most advanced. And, other countries are looking at the 2040s, 2050s. China is serious about actually doing it.
Mm-hmm. Marsha, in your article, you talked about it, the mention of a nuclear-powered space shuttle by 2040 that China's discussing. Could you say more on that?
I wish I could. They put out a space transportation plan, which, as I mentioned there, covers the next generations of their chemical rockets, the Long March series. This nuclear shuttle, it's like a teaser. It's a couple of sentences just saying we're going to do it. So,
interesting.
Yeah, well, Kraft Erica had proposed this. He said, look, this is going to be necessary. You're going to be carting a lot of material between the Earth and the Moon, the orbits of the Earth and the Moon. And he designed a nuclear-powered cargo freighter to go back and forth, not to land. It wouldn't land on the Moon or land on the Earth. It would just go back and forth between the orbits. So, yeah, his idea goes back to the 70s, and maybe the Chinese picked it up from Kraft Erica. Which reminds me of something. This will just take a minute. It intrigued me. I just found this morning. There's a book that's been published recently called Dream Missions, Space Colonies, Nuclear Spacecraft, and Other Possibilities. And it's by Michelle von Pelt. I don't know who that is. This is a review from April of this book, Dream Missions. And this is what the review says. In the opening of Dream Missions, Dutch engineer and author Michelle von Pelt references a talk given at a 1966 symposium by Kraft Erica on, quote, the space age in fiscal 2001. Right, so in 1966, Kraft gave a lecture about what space would look like in 2001. And then he goes through, the reviewer of the book goes through some of the things that Kraft specifically mentioned, some of which, he recognizes were never done. But then he says in the book's conclusion, this Van Pelt comes back to Erica's vision of what could be. And it says that he also predicted applications and utilizations of aerospace technology that have become commonplace. So I found that very interesting. Craft Erica definitely made an impression on people. And for someone to remember a talk that he gave in 1966, I was very impressed.
Mhm. Good. Well, are there any more questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Marsha. It's Ron Betzag. At times in these various budget hearings and debates, you see where Congress weighs in and increases funding. And I'm not citing anything in particular, but I just wondered if you could give kind of an analysis of what are the really forces that actually are somewhat sane on this, or intrigued by actually making something work. What layers have some guts to maybe buck the political fight a little bit? I know it's tied to the present political and economic situation, but what's your evaluation of both the House and Senate, the legislature itself, and also the scientific community in terms of picking these things up at our level?
Well, the space program is one thing that Congress deals with, which has never broken down, well, not never, hardly ever broken down along partisan lines. It is actually something that is recognized to supersede the kind of daily squabbles that you have, whether it's in Congress or elsewhere, that there are more profound and fundamental aspects to why we explore space than a line in a budget. And it's never been a partisan issue. You look all the way back to the history, all the way back to 1958 and the creation of NASA, right, which was proposed as a civilian agency by a Republican president, pushed through Congress by a very aggressive Lyndon Johnson, right, a Democrat Senate leader. So that and actually nuclear energy, both through the years were bipartisan issues. And I think that, as banal and ridiculous as Congress can be at various times, there is a recognition. If you go into the committee hearing room on Capitol Hill of the House Science and Technology Committee, the photographs around the walls of the room, there are some portraits of former committee chairmen, but by and large, the pictures that are interesting are of space. And you have in the front of the room, it would be like behind the chairman, where there is no vision, the people perish, right? So again, as venal as congressmen can get, I think there's always been a recognition that this is something that is human, that supersedes all the petty squabbles and the partisan, fighting in the Congress. Of course, there is also enlightened self-interest, which Keisha can tell you about in terms of the Johnson Space Center. But as you would expect, the representatives and senators who have NASA facilities in their states or in their districts take a special interest, right? Because they're protecting thousands of jobs. So that's, general. And then you have people who don't have any NASA facilities in their districts, but just love the space program. And that is a significant number of people, which I think is mirrored in the population. This whole idea that you could take polls and people don't care about the space program, or they think we spend too much. It's not true. Uh, so, I think that this is also reflected in the Congress. In terms of the scientific community, I have found it fascinating that really I don't remember any other time that these guys have mobilized themselves when they felt that some of the science programs were under threat. Usually it's a very politically docile community, but the Academy of Sciences has spoken out on these things, and the scientific organizations themselves. So I think it's a very optimistic view.
Good. I just want to remind people that they are called China's Lunar. It's very fascinating, and we do have some copies out in the front there. So I would encourage people to read it. You can also go in the Executive Intelligence Review, May 8th. You can go article myself. That was in Executive Intelligence. He must return. So, and question, Marsha, do you have time for one more question?
Sure, but you're breaking up.
Marsha? One
Yes?
more question from.
The question is.
She can't hear you from there, probably.
The question is, with the attacks on China and U.S. collaboration in space with China, would Marsha address that specifically?
Okay, Marsha,
I
hear?
Yes, thank you, Keisha, I did hear. Well, this is an interesting situation. It came out of the Congress. It came out of my former congressman, Frank Wolf, here in Virginia. It was an amendment to the NASA bill a few years ago, and no one has had the guts to take this on. The rest of the House just sort of slavishly passes this thing every year. The administration, and this was actually true in the Obama administration as well, works around it. Unbeknownst to most people, because they don't publicize it, there actually is a lot of cooperation in science with China. So the National Academy of Sciences, through the State Department. In other words, the law is very specific, prohibiting NASA, specifically NASA, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. That's the Office of the Science Advisor. Of course, at the present time, there isn't a science advisor, but only those two agencies, if you will, are named specifically, prohibiting bilateral cooperation with China, specifically in the manned space area. Therefore, the scientific community and various administrations have done what they had to do, basically, to get around that. The Energy Department has all kinds of energy cooperation with China. The Academy of Sciences has seminars that they hold in both countries. The State Department has been the lead agency for space cooperation. NASA people can be in the room. I mean, it's so insane. But the State Department takes the lead on it. So they're not literally, flaunting the law. We exchange weather and meteorological data and remote sensing. There are various areas. Of course, the big stickler here is the manned program. And this is going to hit the fan also, because, this White House is proposing in 2025 to stop funding the International Space Station. Well, I don't know who they think is going to buy it, Warren Buffett or Elon Musk, but the whole thing is insane. And there is going to be another space station operating at that time, built by China. Now, the Chinese, from the very beginning, welcomed other countries to participate. They said, if you want to fly your astronauts up to our space station, they're welcome. You can even build your own laboratory, your own module, fly it up and attach it to our space station. This is, again, remarkable openness. The European Space Agency for the last 2 years has had astronauts learning Chinese. So where they see the future is very clear. So again, we don't know what's going to happen with the International Space Station, but regardless, you're going to have more and more countries orienting to what the Chinese are doing. Certainly the Russians are doing that, the Europeans, and other countries will be doing that as well. So, if no one in Congress has the guts to challenge this thing, it's going to become very obvious in not too many years how foolish it is and, superseded.
As part of cutting the trade deficit, as a back up.
That's good.
All right. So thank you, Marsha. And gave us a sense of what we have to do and accomplish here. Lots of work to do. So with that, we'll end the discussion for today and carry on.